The HOA demolished my home, so I took them to court and took everything. They falsified documents, bulldozed my house without warning, and thought I couldn't fight back. But I exposed their fraud, sued them for millions, and now? Their president is disgraced, the HOA is bankrupt, and I rebuilt stronger than ever. They tried to erase me, now they're the ones who lost everything. Jamie Morgan had always loved his little corner of suburbia. His two-story house wasn't the biggest or the newest on the block, but it was his, a place he'd built his life around, free from the overbearing rules of a homeowners association. No one dictated what color his mailbox had to be, no one fined him for leaving his garbage cans out too long, and no one cared if he wanted to plant roses in his front yard instead of uniform shrubs. That autonomy was part of why he'd chosen this house in the first place. Today had been a particularly good day. The promotion he'd been working toward for over a year was finally within reach. His boss had hinted at it during their morning meeting, and Jamie could already envision the possibilities: a raise, better hours, and finally turning his basement into the home office he'd been dreaming of. As he pulled into his driveway, the setting sun bathed the neighborhood in a warm golden glow. His house, with its freshly painted shutters and neatly trimmed lawn, stood at the end of the cul-de-sac like a quiet sanctuary after a long day of debugging lines of code. He sighed in contentment, ready to park, step inside, and maybe order takeout to celebrate. But as he rounded the corner of his driveway, something felt wrong. The air was unnaturally still. The usual hum of distant lawnmowers and kids playing outside was replaced by an eerie silence. His stomach clenched, and for a moment, he couldn't pinpoint why. Then he saw it. Or rather, what was left of it. Jamie's house was gone. Not damaged. Not vandalized. Not under construction. Gone. In its place was a pile of shattered wood, broken drywall, and mangled furniture scattered haphazardly across the lawn. A thick cloud of dust still hung in the air, and the deep rumble of heavy machinery sent vibrations through the ground. Jamie's breath caught in his throat as he took a staggered step forward, trying to process what he was seeing. A bulldozer, its massive blades still smeared with dust and debris, was backing away from the wreckage. Workers in neon vests moved with casual efficiency, as if dismantling someone's life was just another Tuesday. Some loaded debris into a dump truck, while others stood around a clipboard, chatting like they were deciding where to grab lunch. Jamie's body moved before his mind could catch up. "Hey." His voice came out raw and disbelieving as he marched toward them, his pulse hammering. "What the hell is going on? This is my house." One of the workers, a tall man with graying hair under a hard hat, glanced at him, then wordlessly pointed toward a woman standing off to the side. She was dressed in a sharp navy blazer, a clipboard clutched in her manicured hands like a weapon. Middle-aged, poised, radiating authority, the type of person who'd deliver bad news without flinching. Jamie stormed toward her, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Are you in charge here?" His voice rose as the weight of panic and fury crashed over him. "What have you done to my house?" The woman turned slowly, fixing him with a look of mild irritation, as if he was the one being unreasonable. "Jamie Morgan, I presume?" Her tone was cool, detached. He clenched his jaw. "Yeah, and who the hell are you?" "I'm Carol Stevens, president of the Oakview Homeowners Association." She glanced down at her clipboard and sighed, as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience. This demolition was conducted under Homeowners Association bylaws due to multiple severe violations. Jamie stared at her, his brain struggling to connect the words she had just said into something that made sense. Violations? What violations? His voice cracked. "I'm not even part of the damn HOA." Carol arched a perfectly shaped eyebrow, almost amused by his outburst. "Your property was included in the HOA's jurisdiction during the most recent redrawing of boundaries." She flipped a few pages in her stack of papers. Notices were sent out to all affected homeowners. Jamie's vision blurred with rage. "What notices?" His voice was shaking now. "I've lived here for years. I've never agreed to join your HOA. My property isn't part of your jurisdiction." Carol let out a small, insufferably patient sigh, flipping another page in her clipboard. "We have documentation proving otherwise." She tapped the paper with one neatly manicured finger. "Your property was assessed to have multiple violations, including unapproved external modifications and improper landscaping." Jamie gawked at her. Unapproved modifications? It was his house. Improper landscaping? He had a lawn and some flower beds. The board voted to proceed with corrective action, she continued smoothly. Jamie's blood turned to fire. "Corrective action?" His voice rose to a shout. "You demolished my home without telling me. How is that even legal?" Carol's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked bored. "Mr. Morgan, the HOA operates within the guidelines of its charter," she said. "If you have concerns, I suggest you take them up with legal counsel." She snapped her clipboard shut. "But as far as we're concerned, this matter is closed." Jamie took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You've made a mistake," he growled. "I'm not in your HOA. You destroyed my house, my entire life, because of some made-up rule that doesn't even apply to me." Carol's smile faded slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Mr. Morgan," she said flatly, "if you continue to behave in this manner, I'll have no choice but to involve law enforcement." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement as if she had just wrapped up a business transaction, not ruined someone's life. Jamie stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Around him, the workers kept loading the wreckage of his home into dump trucks, unfazed. The house he had saved for, the home he had built memories in, the place where he had planned his future, was now reduced to rubble, as if it had never existed at all. He felt nausea, rage, and disbelief swirl inside him in a way he couldn't control. Then, suddenly, like a switch-flipping, rage overtook him completely. He would not let this stand. Jamie Morgan had just lost everything, but one thing was clear. The HOA had picked the wrong guy to bulldoze. Jamie sat at his friend Paul's dining table, gripping his laptop so tightly his knuckles turned white. His house was gone, his life reduced to rubble, and all he had now were questions with no answers. His heart pounded as he scrolled through emails, flipped through old documents, and dug through every legal paper he could find. There had to be proof, something that showed his property was never part of the HOA. His fingers trembled as he opened the original deed from when he bought the house. There it was, clear as day. No mention of HOA affiliation, no binding contract, no requirement to follow their rules. He flipped through the property survey he'd received at closing. His lot was outside of the Oakview Homeowners Association boundaries. But somehow, none of that had mattered. His house had still been destroyed like it was nothing. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as he scanned his inbox for any notice from the HOA. Nothing. No emails. No letters. No warnings. His property taxes had been paid, his mortgage was in good standing, and nowhere in any document did it say he was under HOA control. Yet, they had bulldozed his home as if it were some abandoned shack. Frustration burned in his chest as he grabbed his phone and dialed the city office. After being transferred from department to department, he finally landed on someone who could help. "City Records Department," a tired voice answered. "Yeah, my name is Jamie Morgan. My house was just demolished by the Oakview HOA, and I need to know why the hell they had permission to do that when I'm not even part of their damn association." His voice was barely controlled rage. There was a long silence. "Sir, what's the address?" Jamie gave it to him, tapping his fingers impatiently against the table. The sound of keyboard clacking filled the background as the city worker pulled up the records. Then, a pause. "Huh," the man muttered. Jamie sat up straighter. What is it?" "Well, according to the records, your property was officially added to the Oakview Homeowners Association last year when the boundaries were redrawn." Jamie's stomach dropped. "Last year? That's impossible. I never agreed to that. I never signed anything." "That's the thing," the man said slowly. "These boundary changes don't require homeowner approval. The HOA submitted the revision to the city council, and since no one objected during the public review period, it was approved by default." Jamie's mouth went dry. "You're telling me that while I was just living my life, my property was handed over to the HOA without me even knowing? Notices were mailed out, but if you didn't respond, it was considered uncontested." Jamie gritted his teeth, trying to keep himself from smashing his fist into the table. "I never got any notices." "Then it's possible the HOA didn't send them." The city workers sighed. "Look, I've seen this before. Some HOAs expand their territory without homeowners realizing it, especially if they think nobody will fight it. But I'll be honest with you, this situation, a full demolition? That's extreme, even for a power-hungry HOA." Jamie closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. He felt like the walls were closing in, like his entire world had been rewritten without his consent. They had stolen his home, all because some bureaucratic form had been filed in the shadows, slipping past unnoticed. His fists clenched as a new emotion replaced his shock and despair, pure, burning rage. "Who signed off on the demolition permit?" he demanded. There was another pause. "It was expedited by the Oakview HOA, approved by the city after they submitted documentation stating the house was abandoned and uninhabitable." Jamie almost laughed out loud at the sheer insanity of it. His house had been perfectly fine, and they had somehow faked documents to justify tearing it down. His blood felt like it was boiling. Who in the city approved it? The man hesitated. That would be the zoning board. But if you're planning to fight this, I'd suggest getting a lawyer. You're going to be in for one hell of a legal battle. Jamie's jaw tightened. Oh, trust me, I'm already planning on it. He hung up and stared at his laptop screen, his pulse hammering in his ears. The HOA had redrawn boundaries behind his back. They had lied to the city, and they had forged documents to erase his home from existence. And now, Carol Stevens had the audacity to tell him to take it up with legal counsel and walk away like she hadn't just ruined his life. Well, she was about to find out that she had picked the wrong man to screw over. Jamie had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous kind of enemy. He was going to burn them to the ground. Jamie wasted no time. The next morning, after a night of restless anger and combing through legal forums, he called the first attorney he could find who specialized in HOA disputes. The receptionist at Roberts and Hamilton law offices transferred him to a woman named Nellie Anderson, a junior attorney who, despite her polite tone, wasted no time getting to the point. "They demolished your house?" she repeated after he explained what had happened. There was a brief pause before she added, "And you were never part of the HOA to begin with?" Jamie clenched his jaw. "That's right. I have the deed, the original neighborhood survey, everything. They just decided to redraw boundaries, claim my house, and bulldoze it like they owned the damn place." Nellie let out a slow exhale. "Mr. Morgan, this isn't just overreach. This is fraud. And if what you're telling me is true, we're not talking about a simple civil case. We're talking about massive legal violations." Jamie met her in person that afternoon. She was younger than he expected, early 30s, sharp-eyed, and businesslike, with an air of focus that gave him the first flicker of hope since this nightmare began. She spread out his documents on her desk, scanning them with meticulous precision, occasionally jotting notes. "Your deed explicitly states that your property is not under the HOA's jurisdiction," she said, tapping the paper with her pen. "That alone is enough to prove that they had no authority over you. But the real problem is how they got the city to approve the demolition." Jamie watched as she pulled up public records on her laptop, clicking through permits and council filings. Then she froze. "Bingo," she murmured. Turning the screen toward him, she pointed at a boundary amendment request filed by the HOA last year. "This is how they got you." They submitted a revised map to the county and claimed that they had notified all affected homeowners. If no one objects, it's approved by default. Jamie's fists clenched. "I never got a notice." Nellie smirked. "Of course, you didn't. That's the trick. HOAs count on homeowners not noticing these changes. But this case goes beyond a simple boundary change. The demolition permit was approved under the claim that your house was abandoned. And that's where we catch them." She scrolled further down. "Here." The HOA submitted photographs of an abandoned property to justify the demolition. Jamie leaned in, staring at the images. His stomach turned. The photos were not of his house. The images showed a rundown, boarded-up home, a place that looked nothing like the carefully maintained property he had lived in for years. "These lying sons of B," he stopped himself, his breathing ragged. "They straight up falsified evidence to get my house torn down." Nellie nodded. "And that, Mr. Morgan, is fraud. We now have a clear path to take them down." But Jamie wasn't done. If the HOA had done this to him, how many others had they screwed over? He started talking to his neighbors, knocking on doors, asking if anyone else had been forced to comply with ridiculous HOA demands. What he found made his blood boil even more. An elderly woman named Mrs. Caldwell, who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, had nearly been fined out of her home for planting roses in her front yard. Roses that, according to the HOA, disrupted the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. A young couple down the street had been threatened with towing fees for parking their car in their own driveway because it was too old and didn't meet the HOA's vehicle appearance guidelines. But the worst? A single mother who had been harassed for months after the HOA claimed her backyard shed was a structural violation and tried to fine her until she had no choice but to sell her house and move. "This is a pattern," Nellie said when Jamie reported his findings. "They aren't just enforcing rules, they're expanding their power, targeting homeowners who technically aren't even under their control and intimidating them into compliance." And sure enough, the moment the HOA caught wind of what Jamie was doing, the intimidation tactic started. It began with calls from unknown numbers. No one spoke when he answered. Then came the letter, left in his friend Paul's mailbox, and signed but clear in its message, "Drop this, or things will get worse for you." A few days later, someone slashed his car tires. Jamie wasn't an idiot. He knew what this was. Fear tactics. Attempts to make him back off. He brought the letter to Nellie, who barely blinked. "That's cute," she muttered, folding it neatly. "If they think this is going to scare you off, they have no idea who they're messing with." Jamie wasn't afraid. He was furious. These people had bulldozed his life, tried to erase his existence, and now thought they could bully him into submission? No, not a chance. If the Oakview HOA thought they could intimidate him into silence, they were about to realize just how badly they had underestimated him. The courtroom was smaller than Jamie expected, but the weight of the moment made it feel suffocating. He sat beside Nellie, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as the judge entered, calling the session to order. Across the room sat Carol Stevens, composed as ever, flanked by a team of HOA lawyers who oozed corporate arrogance. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. Jamie clenched his jaw. She should be. Nellie stood, poised and confident, addressing the court with the kind of calm authority that made Jamie grateful she was on his side. "Your Honor, we are here today because the Oakview Homeowners Association has not only violated my client's property rights, but engaged in fraudulent activity to justify the demolition of his home. Mr. Morgan's property was never part of the HOA, yet they illegally redrew neighborhood boundaries without notice, fabricated violations, and ultimately had his house bulldozed under the false claim that it was abandoned. We have clear evidence proving the HOA's actions were not only unlawful but malicious." The HOA's lead attorney, Richard Caldwell, stood next, adjusting his suit jacket like he was about to deliver an Oscar-worthy defense. "Your Honor, the Homeowners Association was operating within its rights as a governing body tasked with maintaining community standards. Mr. Morgan's property was included in the HOA's jurisdiction as per city records, and any discrepancies in communication were unintentional. This was not an act of malice. It was simply a misunderstanding." Jamie nearly scoffed out loud. A misunderstanding? His home was reduced to dust, and they were calling it a simple mix-up? He could feel his pulse hammering in his ears as Nellie smirked, clearly prepared for this pathetic excuse of a defense. "Unintentional," she repeated, flipping through a stack of documents before holding one up. "Then explain this." She walked toward the judge, handing over the first smoking gun of the case, the boundary amendment request filed by the HOA last year. This document shows that the HOA submitted a request to extend their jurisdiction, including Mr. Morgan's property, without his knowledge or consent. Not only was he never notified, but the HOA falsely claimed that all affected homeowners had been informed and had no objections. That was a lie, and we can prove it. The judge skimmed the document, his brow furrowing. Richard Caldwell shifted in his seat, but quickly rebounded. "Your Honor, these boundary changes were public record. Mr. Morgan had every opportunity to contest them if he wished." "That would be a valid argument," Nellie countered, "if Mr. Morgan had ever received the notice in the first place. But he didn't, because the HOA never sent one. And conveniently, there is no official record of it being mailed to him. That alone is a direct violation of property law." Jamie stole a glance at Carol Stevens. For the first time, he saw her shoulders tighten, her fingers gripping her pen just a little too hard. Good, but Nellie wasn't done. She pulled up the next piece of evidence on the large screen at the front of the courtroom, a permit request filed by the HOA to demolish Jamie's home. "This is the demolition permit," she said, her voice razor-sharp. "Expedited by the HOA, approved by the city under the claim that Mr. Morgan's home was abandoned and uninhabitable." She turned toward the judge, her expression fierce. "Your Honor, my client's home was in perfect condition before it was destroyed. The HOA falsified information to obtain this permit." Richard Caldwell cleared his throat, already trying to pivot. "While the paperwork may have had inconsistencies." "Inconsistencies?" Nellie cut in before he could finish. "You mean fraud?" The room tensed. The judge's gaze hardened. Caldwell looked rattled, but still kept his composure. Perhaps there was an error in assessment. That's when Nellie delivered the knockout punch. She clicked to the next slide. A set of photographs appeared on the screen, images the HOA had submitted as proof that Jamie's home was abandoned. Only they weren't pictures of Jamie's house. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jamie's heart slammed against his ribs as he stared at the photos, his rage burning hotter than ever. Nellie turned back to the judge. These photos were submitted to the city council as part of the demolition request. But these are not pictures of Mr. Morgan's property. The HOA deliberately used images of an abandoned structure from a completely different location to justify their actions. That is premeditated fraud, and it is undeniable. The room fell silent. Richard Caldwell opened his mouth, closed it again, then turned to Carol Stevens, who sat stone-faced as if refusing to acknowledge the evidence laid out before her. The judge's expression darkened. "Mr. Caldwell, are you suggesting that the HOA cannot distinguish between a well-maintained home and an abandoned structure?" His tone was laced with disgust. Caldwell hesitated. "Your Honor, Because," the judge continued, cutting him off, "that would imply either gross incompetence or deliberate deception, and neither reflect well on your case." Jamie glanced at Carol, the woman who had treated him like an inconvenience, who had smugly told him that this matter was closed, was now visibly stiff, her jaw tight, eyes flickering toward the exit like she was desperate to leave. The cracks were forming, and Nellie wasn't done breaking them apart. Jamie sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His breath was slow, controlled, but his heart pounded like a war drum against his ribs. Across the courtroom, Carol Stevens sat rigid, her once impenetrable mask of control now cracking under the weight of cold, undeniable evidence. Even her attorney, Richard Caldwell, had given up trying to spin their defense into something remotely salvageable. The fraud, the illegal boundary changes, the falsified demolition permit, it was all exposed. And now, they were waiting for the judge to deliver the final blow. The courtroom was silent as the judge straightened his papers, clearing his throat. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. This court has reviewed the evidence presented in Morgan v. Oakview Homeowners Association and finds that the defendant, the HOA, engaged in fraudulent activity, including the unauthorized expansion of jurisdiction, the falsification of city records, and the illegal destruction of the plaintiff's home, the judge said, his voice firm, resolute. He shifted his gaze toward Carol Stevens and her legal team. Not only did the defendant fail to provide proper notification to the homeowner, but they actively deceived city officials in order to obtain a demolition permit under false pretenses. Such actions constitute a gross abuse of power and malicious intent. Jamie could feel his pulse in his ears. The court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Jamie Morgan. The Oakview Homeowners Association is hereby ordered to pay full restitution for the destruction of Mr. Morgan's home, including all associated rebuilding costs. Furthermore, the court awards the plaintiff additional punitive damages due to the HOA's egregious misconduct. A wave of relief crashed over Jamie so hard he nearly slumped forward in his chair. It was over. He had won. But the judge wasn't finished. In addition, due to the extent of fraudulent activity uncovered in this case, the Oakview Homeowners Association is hereby fined $750,000 for its violations. This court also recommends an immediate review of the HOA's operational practices and its compliance with state and federal property laws. Should further infractions be uncovered, additional legal action will be pursued. Jamie stole a glance at Carol Stevens. The color had drained from her face. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken. But then came the final nail in the coffin. As for Carol Stevens, president of the Oakview Homeowners Association, the court finds that her direct involvement in these fraudulent activities constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and willful misconduct. Effective immediately, she is removed from her position as HOA president. Any attempt to continue involvement in the association's affairs will result in criminal proceedings. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Carol sat frozen, staring straight ahead as if she had just been sentenced to death. Jamie exhaled, a slow, trembling breath that he hadn't even realized he was holding. He turned to Nellie, who sat beside him with a small, knowing smirk, arms crossed in satisfaction. Carol Stevens was finished. The HOA had been crushed. The judge struck the gavel. This court is adjourned. For a long moment, Jamie didn't move. He just sat there, absorbing the sheer weight of everything that had just happened. It had felt like a war, an exhausting, vicious battle, but he had done it. He had taken on the unstoppable force of HOA corruption and won. As he stood, shaking hands with Nellie, Carol finally moved. She stood stiffly, her entire body taut with rage and humiliation, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. She turned toward Jamie, her cold, calculating eyes burning with something between hatred and disbelief. But she said nothing. There was nothing left to say. She had lost. She stormed out of the courtroom, her army of lawyers trailing behind her, whispering frantically amongst themselves, probably already calculating how to salvage whatever was left of their reputations. Jamie exhaled, running a hand down his face. "Holy shit," he muttered under his breath. "I actually won." Nellie let out a short laugh, shaking her head. "You didn't just win, Jamie. You set a precedent. HOAs don't lose cases like this very often. This is going to make waves." And she was right. Reporters had been hovering outside the courthouse all week, sniffing around for a story, and sure enough, as soon as Jamie stepped outside, a swarm of journalists descended on him like vultures. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved toward his face. "Mr. Morgan, how do you feel about today's ruling? Did you ever expect to win against an HOA? Do you have a message for other homeowners dealing with HOA overreach?" Jamie held up a hand, feeling the exhaustion settling deep into his bones. "I just want to go home," he muttered. But the words felt hollow, because he didn't have a home anymore. Yes, he had one. Yes, the HOA would pay for what they did. But at the end of the day, he was still standing in the middle of a city street, homeless, exhausted, and staring down the long road of rebuilding his life from scratch. The fight was over, but his battle wasn't finished yet. Jamie stood at the empty lot where his house had once been, the sun casting long shadows across the ground. The rubble was gone, the debris hauled away, and in its place was a fresh foundation, a blank slate waiting to be built upon. It had been months since the courtroom victory, months of legal back and forth as the HOA finally paid out the damages they owed him. The check had cleared. The permits were approved. And now he was finally ready to rebuild. The construction crew had arrived early that morning, a team of contractors recommended by Nellie's firm, people he could trust. Jamie had been careful with every decision, selecting stronger materials, better insulation, reinforced structures. He wasn't just rebuilding his home, he was making sure that no one would ever take it from him again. As he stood there, watching the workers frame the first walls, a strange mix of emotions settled in his chest. Relief, exhaustion, and something else, something like pride. This wasn't just a house. This was his fight, his victory, his proof that he refused to be erased. Paul pulled up in his truck, stepping out with 2 coffees in hand. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing one over. Jamie took it, nodding his thanks. "Hard to believe, huh?" Paul gestured at the construction, taking a sip from his cup. "A few months ago, this place was nothing but dust." Jamie exhaled, staring at the framework. "Yeah, feels like a lifetime ago." And in some ways, it was. He wasn't the same person who had come home that night, expecting a normal evening, only to find his entire life ripped apart. He had been blindsided, powerless, lost. But now, he had fought back, won, and come out the other side stronger. "How's the HOA holding up?" Paul asked, smirking. Jamie huffed a short laugh. "Barely. The fines wrecked their budget. Carol Stevens is gone. Half the board resigned. And homeowners who actually wanted to be in the HOA are pushing for major reforms." He shook his head. "They're scared. No one wants to be the next lawsuit." Paul grinned. "Guess you did more than just get justice for yourself." Jamie hadn't really thought about it that way, but it was true. His fight had sent a message, not just to Oakview, but to HOAs everywhere. The case had gained media attention, and after the ruling, lawyers across the state had started questioning how many other HOAs had illegally expanded their control over homeowners. It turned out Jamie wasn't alone. Other people started coming forward, sharing their own horror stories, absurd fines, shady boundary changes, intimidation tactics. Some even reached out to Jamie directly, asking for advice, thanking him for showing that these organizations weren't untouchable. One email had stuck with him. A woman named Mia from a nearby town had written, "Your story gave me the courage to fight back. They've been trying to find me into foreclosure for months. Not anymore. Thank you." Jamie had read that email twice, letting the words sink in. His battle hadn't just been for himself. It had been for everyone who had ever been bullied into silence. Paul clapped a hand on his shoulder. "So, when's the housewarming party?" Jamie chuckled. "Let's get the roof on first." The two stood in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee, watching the house take shape. The HOA had tried to erase him, but now, piece by piece, Jamie was building himself back stronger than ever. Jamie never thought he'd become an activist. He never imagined himself standing in front of a room full of frustrated homeowners, holding up his case as proof that they could fight back. But here he was, speaking at a local town hall meeting, a microphone in his hand, telling his story to people who had spent years feeling powerless against their HOA. "I was just like you," he said, scanning the room. "I thought I had no choice. I thought they could do whatever they wanted, and I just had to take it. And then one day, I came home, and my house was gone." The murmur of outrage rippled through the audience, people shaking their heads, some nodding along, others scribbling down notes. "But I fought back, and I won. And if I can do it, so can you." The past few months had been a blur of rebuilding, legal wrap-ups, and endless messages from people across the country. Homeowners who had been fined into bankruptcy, harassed for minor infractions, were forced to sell their homes because they couldn't afford to fight back. His inbox was flooded with emails, his phone buzzing daily with new calls from strangers looking for guidance. It wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about all of them. With Nilly's help, he had started a neighborhood coalition, a support network where homeowners could share legal resources, document HOA abuses, and, if necessary, file lawsuits against corrupt associations. It started small, just a few people in his area. But then it grew. Fast. One day, a journalist covering his case asked if they could do a follow-up story. Jamie hesitated at first. He had never liked the spotlight. But when he realized how many people needed to hear what had happened, he agreed. The article went viral. Within weeks, he was talking to lawmakers, pushing for new regulations that would require HOAs to be more transparent, limit their power over non-members, and prevent them from redrawing boundaries without homeowner consent. He never set out to be the face of a movement, but somehow, that's what he had become. And despite all of it, the chaos, the lawsuits, the rebuilding, Jamie finally felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. By the time his house was fully restored, he had changed. His home was the same, yet different, better. A little stronger. A little smarter. Just like him. On the first quiet evening after the final touches were done, he sat on his new porch swing, the same spot where he had once sipped coffee and enjoyed the peace of his little suburban life. Except this time, that peace had been earned. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the yard. His house stood tall, solid, a testament to what he had fought for, what he had refused to let be taken from him. His phone buzzed beside him, another homeowner looking for advice. Jamie glanced at the screen, then smiled, leaning back, rocking gently on the swing. He called him back soon. For now, he just wanted to breathe it all in. He had stood up for himself, and he had won.